Who should decide how we teach math?
Welcome to Answers News for April 27th, 2022.
Hi, I'm Bryan Osborne. I'm here with Webb and Tim Chaffey. We're so glad you are here. And before we look at the tensions over math textbooks over in Florida, our first headline for today will be this one, our fluff piece, but not really all that fluffy.
Yeah.
But the title sounds kind of fluffy and fun. Man told employer not to celebrate his birthday. He was awarded $450,000 after an unwanted party. Now, we have a live audience. I bet you guys would accept $400,000 for an unwanted party, right? That's not really the context of this particular event. What happened is the man has panic attacks. And so he asked his employer not to throw a party for him. His employer did. So he had a panic attack, kind of freaked out, caused a little conflict between management and him. Eventually he got fired. Then it all went to court, and he was awarded $400,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's different, two sides to every story. We don't know exactly what happened. The employer says one thing, the employee says something else. One thing that that we talked about beforehand is we want to make sure that we're not making light of some mental illnesses. There are real issues that people struggle with that sometimes if you haven't been around it before, it's hard to understand that. And so maybe a headline like that would seem funny, but if you're in the situation or if you have a loved one who really struggles with things like that, it can be very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So I don't want to make light of it.
Yeah, exactly. And the poor guy had it twice. I think he had a panic attack. So.
Yeah, I think this article reminds me with the title, Don't Judge a Book by Its Cover. The title sounds really fun and fluffy. It's really kind of a sad article in different ways. And then also, as you mentioned, Tim, Proverbs 18:17. The first one to state their case seems right, so another comes along and gives a cross-examination of what they said. It's always important to listen to both sides before you make any conclusions about something.
Yep.
But I wish it was a bit more fun because the rest of the articles are much more serious. So,
no matter how you slice it.
That's right.
Boss who takes the cake.
Oh, boy.
Wow. Bodie would be proud, all right?
One more of those and we're cutting your mic.
Can we just cut it now? Can we just do it right off the bat?
Fill up my quota real quick here.
All right, next article for today. Florida rejects 41% of math textbooks for including CRT, mostly aimed at K through fifth graders. And it says this should be impermissible. So what happened here recently is Florida, who's being led by Ron DeSantis. I bet you've heard of him here recently. Really standing up for a lot of different rights. But they were looking at recent math textbooks, what to incorporate in this new year. And they rejected the majority, or at least almost the majority of them, because they're trying to implement the ideologies of CRT, or social emotional learning, which also tries to import kind of CRT ideas into the text, into math. So it's not just enough now to teach 2 + 2 = 4, but no, we must import a secular ideology to indoctrinate your kids starting in even kindergarten.
Yeah. Yeah, and who knew math was racist, right? So it just... And I think really this should remind us for any parents that are out there that have kids in the public school. I mean, this is something that they're going to have to also deal with too. You're seeing it more and more every year, every month. You're seeing more of this ideology, like Bryan was saying, that's slowly infiltrating all these public school systems. And really, it's just another religion, right? Basically, they're just imposing another religion of secular humanism onto a lot of these kids. And just real quick, for those that aren't familiar with CRT, it's critical race theory. It's based on critical social justice. Basically, you have the oppressors and the oppressed, right? And typically, it's the white male American Christian that's basically considered the oppressor. No matter what you do, it's going to be inherently within you. It's systemic racism is basically what it's called, and they're basically oppressing the black people, the minorities, and so that's the kind of the framework that they have, of course, and it's very based on a lot of Marxist ideologies, right? And so if you've ever studied Marxism, it's very anti-biblical, anti-gospel to its core as well, right? So this is not something that we should be even entertaining in our schools or our churches at all. This is something we should be completely and utterly rejecting and moving away from.
Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that you talked about how it's coming to other schools. This is news because Florida is rejecting them, whereas most states haven't been.
That's right.
Meaning these same textbooks are being submitted to 49 other states around the country, and they're accepting it.
Yeah.
Now, they are allowed to, the publishers can appeal those rejections. Maybe there's some wording in there that could be tweaked, or maybe it was just misunderstood. But, yeah, what's the purpose of adding all this social engineering into math? I want, if somebody's going to build my house, I want to make sure they understand what 2 + 2 = and what these other things equal, rather than how does it make them feel, or rather than how does learning this teach me how whites have oppressed others throughout history because I'm being forced to learn this when I don't want to.
Right.
It's nonsensical, but it's not reading, writing, arithmetic anymore. It really
It's
is
not.
social engineering in most of our school systems. So kudos to Florida and Ron DeSantis for standing up for really the rights of parents and for what is really just logical. Teaching math should be non-discriminatory. Other than some of us aren't as good as others. Mr. Rocket Scientist here, I'm pretty sure he
I've
could beat
taken
the
a few.
three of us
Few.
in math, I think.
Advanced Calculus 3, linear algebra, vector calculus, anything like that?
I can spell it.
Those are fun classes.
I can Google it. I can look it up.
And then what cracks me up too is you have all these colleges and universities that are now saying, well, we have to look at these formulas and these math textbooks and see if they actually come from white people, white guys in the past. And that's a serious problem. You think about it. Guys like Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Einstein,
Right.
they were all white guys, right? So you throw out them, you pretty much demolished all the physics and even bridge building and building houses like Tim was saying. So it's ultimately a worldview that's inconsistent and it's going to blow up on itself.
And really, they shouldn't be worried about where these ideas came from, because in a sense, it's a form of genetic fallacy that we can't trust something because of where it came from. What they should be concerned about is it true?
Yep.
Does it correspond to reality?
Yep.
And math does.
But you're using logic, Tim, and that's the issue.
Yeah.
Which is part of the oppressive construct put in
Yeah.
place by the oppressors, according to CRT.
I can't help it though. I'm,
Yeah,
So-
I'm
see.
a white Christian straight male. I
Yeah.
have the most negative
have
intersectionality
all
point, and
the
I'm tall.
points.
So
Yeah,
I've got
all
all
three
of
of
it.
us, right?
I check
Exactly
all the
right.
boxes. And
Yeah.
Two of the quick things about this. First of all, look at what they're trying to do. They're trying to actually impose a secular ideology into math. It made me think of, we have a Christian school we kind of partner with called 12 Stones. And within that school, we're trying to import a Christian worldview into every single subject. What can we learn about God and biblical truths in this particular area? It's kind of woven all the way through, because that's our religion, that's our passion. God is the author of everything, so we want to see that in all things. But please note, the secularist wants to do the same thing. They want their worldview, their religious ideas imported into every single subject, so they can raise up good revolutionaries, people, ideologues who conform to their worldview and can be evangelists for their particular brand of religion. So please note, these people are not neutral. They have religious ideologies they want to impose on others. And so understand that. And the second thing is, be aware, dear parent or grandparent, if you have kids who are going to public universities or schools, they're being taught this ideology. Now, the phrase critical race theory has come under so much fire that most people won't admit they're teaching CRT, but it goes by different names. And sometimes the social emotional learning, SEL, is kind of a Trojan horse that's used to import these really the socialistic ideas or CRT ideas into a classroom setting. So be sure you are paying close attention to what your kids are getting if they're getting these sort of ideas, because it may change names, but the ideas are still the same.
And we have this tendency, a lot of us, to think, well, I went through public school and it wasn't that bad. Things have changed very, very
true.
rapidly,
Yeah,
and we need to
absolutely.
be aware of that.
Yeah.
They changed from my parents' generation to my generation. They've changed from my generation to my kids' generation, now to Rob's generation, the real young people like him. That's
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say within even the last 5 years, the
Yes.
change has been so rapid.
Yeah, it's just-
a lot of the
it's
things we see happening today
exponential.
would be unrecognizable 5 years ago.
Right.
Right. And so, absolutely.
And just real quick before we move on to the next article, we actually have a resource written by Bodhi Balcom. It's called Fault Line. It's a really good book.
Fantastic.
Fantastic book. If you guys want to learn more about critical race theory, about the implications of it, how it relates to the Bible in terms of even its own religious stances too. I mean, you even have they have doctrine, they have theology behind this. A lot of the critical race theory, they call it anti-racism, basically. So
No, we can't really trust that book, though. It's written by a white guy, right?
it's written by a black guy.
No, Bodhi
actually.
Balcom is not a white guy.
And
So-
it's actually interesting. The first couple chapters, he actually talks about his biography and what he
Right.
grew up with. It was really interesting, really fascinating to read.
Yeah.
I definitely encourage you guys to check
That's
it out.
very good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. Astronomers make an astonishing find in the sky right ahead of Easter. So this particular article, evidently written by, we think, a Christian who's embracing some sort of theistic evolution. He thinks God used evolution over a long period of time, but we think he believes in some sort of God based on the article. But in the article, they say they found the oldest star ever seen. They call the star Arendelle, something like that?
Arendelle.
Arendelle,
Arendelle,
there
yeah,
you go. That's
yeah.
more like it, Arendelle. And they said this star is the oldest star we've ever observed. We're seeing the star as it was, according to the article, about 12.8 billion years ago, which puts it around or about 900 million years after the Big Bang. And so they're seeing the light from this star. And so we actually see the star itself, or the light itself. They assume it's traveled long distances. Light years is actually a unit of distance, not actually time. And they assume it's been traveling for a long time. So we're seeing the light now, but they're assuming it's traveled for billions of years. So the actual star that sent the light initially has long since died and exploded and is gone. So we got to really separate the fact versus the fiction in this particular article. What do we see in the present? A star. We see the starlight in the present. That's what we actually observe. Now, how you interpret that and what you think happened in the past, what would happen in the future, is all based on your worldview. And that's a clear distinction we've got to really mark out as we go through this sort of article.
Yeah, really, this is all based on an evolutionary, naturalistic worldview, based on the Big Bang model. I'm sure you guys have all heard about that. And if you actually want to know more, you can actually go onto our website. It basically exposes a lot of the problems, the issues with the Big Bang model itself, and how it really doesn't jive with the Genesis account at all. But overall, I think, like Bryan was saying, separate the facts from the fiction. The facts are pretty cool. It's a giant star, 50 times the size of our sun. It's 1 million times brighter. And I also like that they mentioned that they want to take a better look at Earendel with the more powerful Webb Space Telescope, which I think will be really interesting. That's the, if you guys aren't familiar, that's the telescope, the huge $10 billion observatory that was just launched last Christmas. It's out there. They're currently going through all the calibration right now, trying to get it ready to go.
And there's even controversy about the name. We covered that a couple of weeks ago. Where
and I'm not related to him, in case you guys are wondering.
Well, yes, you are.
Well, yeah, that's true. That's true.
Back to Adam. Yeah.
back to Adam. Back to Noah's family.
And maybe
I
probably
feel like you
closer.
told me that last time.
I did, yeah, because you keep denying it. Now, so let me ask you a question. You know a lot more about stars and this than I would. So it says that it's more than 50 times the size of our sun and 1 million times brighter. How much of that can we truly know? I mean, are they're measuring the distance based on the shifting of the light? And
yeah, it's called gravitational lensing is basically how they're doing it. Yeah.
So are these kind of ballpark figures? Are they real precise? Are they kind of estimating a lot of things that are more, there's a little more storytelling in that than we would recognize?
There is some, but at the same time, you have to be able to distinguish between what we observe versus what we're assuming, interpreting based on past assumptions, of course, right? And that's why a lot of these times they kind of insert the Big Bang model assumption into there. And like Bryan was saying, a light year is a unit of distance, not time. So even though they're seeing this really, really far away, and it truly is really far away, of course, but it's the assumption that it took this light billions and billions and billions of years in order to reach us, of course, and that's based on the naturalistic worldview. But what I like about this, that's at the very end, like Bryan was saying, it seems like this guy maybe has some kind of a theistic evolution kind of worldview. But he says these continuing discoveries show just how little we truly know about the cosmos, and it can't help but evoke wonder and amazement at the majesty of creation. We wouldn't agree more, of course, right? Because it's Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim his handiwork. So that's why we should be studying the stars, of course, but we have to be doing it with the right reasons, of course. And that's why it really comes down to, is it man's word or is it God's word? Which one's going to be our starting authority when we're looking at these kind of stories? And just a real quick plug as well, if you guys want to learn more about this James Webb Space Telescope, I actually wrote an article just last year basically talking about the biblical response to that as well. So if you guys want to learn more about how, from a biblical worldview, how a Christian should be analyzing these kinds of missions, I would definitely encourage you guys to check that out.
It was good, too. Not bad for a rocket scientist.
It's just rocket science.
And I would also recommend, this is what I was going to bring up, is our planetarium at the Creation Museum.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, yeah.
I have no trouble with a star being 50 times the size of our sun. I've seen our program.
Yeah.
I was wondering how much of this was storytelling. But yeah, if you guys haven't been to the Creation Museum or the planetarium, those of you in the live audience, make sure you check that out, The Created Cosmos. And those of you watching online, come on down and check it out. It's pretty amazing.
Absolutely.
It is really awesome. And then let's just stay in space. Why not? All right. Jupiter's moon Europa may have habitable ice shell. Yeah, just a little bit closer. So we have over Jupiter's moon Europa. There's saltwater ocean underneath it that we believe we see water coming through. There's ice covering it. There's an ice shell. We see kind of these ridges of ice and water, maybe actually vapor coming through those ice ridges. So there's maybe salt water underneath that, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And basically, according to the article, recently scientists have been looking at Greenland and saw some smaller versions of the ice ridges, and they're looking at how those things operate and function, how there's water underneath there, how the water can maybe pool up, and actually if it comes to surface, garners some elements or resources, comes back down and pools together in particular cavities underneath, then maybe somehow if all the right stuff is in just the right place at just the right time in Europa, life might be able to form. And really, this is all kind of rooted in the evolutionary ideology that life came about by random chance process. And so if it evolved here by accident, surely it evolved somewhere else by accident, or is evolving by just natural chemical processes over time. So really trying to find evidence for that sort of idea.
Yeah, that's kind of what's driving this whole thing. Is if it evolved here, it had to evolve in other places, and they have this assumption that wherever they find water, they're going to find life. So Europa, there is evidence that there is probably water underneath the sheets, and that's why they're saying this has to be a really good kind of indicator that there could be life there, of course. And it's all based on this field, if you guys have heard of it, called astrobiology, which is, it cracks me up because you can actually get
Just
degrees
backed up
in
by
this.
hard science, right?
Yeah, you can actually
get a PhD
You can get a
in-
PhD in this. I remember there's actually a couple missions that they mentioned in here. It's called the Europa Clipper and ESA's Juice mission. So it's two different missions. I remember I was part of the proposal efforts for that. And I remember during meetings, we would have PhDs of these astrobiologists come in and actually talk to us about the missions and the goals. And
But
I'm
what is
thinking,
astrobiology?
yeah, and that's the weirdest thing is astrobiology. It's the study of life in outer space, right? But have we found any of that? There's no evidence for it. We haven't observed it. Yet you can take degrees in this, classes in it, get PhDs.
A lot of
in
times
it,
what they're
and-
doing is they're looking at the chemical makeup of different planets and things, trying to, like they're talking about with this
Yeah.
moon. So they are looking at certain physical things, but it really has nothing to do with biology.
Yeah, it just cracks me up, basically. And,
Can you get a
and
PhD in like Bigfoot studies or something? I mean,
that's what it reminds
Loch Ness
me of.
Monster? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or you could study Star Wars, right? Star
Yeah.
Trek. That'd be your research.
Maybe
That's
that's what
not
they're
real.
doing in their
Astrobiology.
classes. They're just watching Star Wars, and that's
Brian,
how
you
they're
thought
getting their
that was
degrees.
real.
Klingons, Wookiees, the whole 9 yards.
It's almost-
Oh, now you're
It's almost
mixing
made
shows.
for-
You can't do that. We'll
It's
get
almost made
letters.
for-
Oh, that's Star
Don't
Trek
spoil
and
it
Star
for
Wars.
us.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Shows how much I actually know about it. But yeah, I mean, regardless, even if Europa is covered completely in water, which we haven't fully actually discovered yet, we haven't actually gone there yet, it really doesn't prove anything other than the fact that it's covered with water, right? Of
Right.
course. And I think we should be exploring other places, other bodies in the solar system in order to see and better see God's glory in all of it. And that should be the real reason why we do that.
And really part of the motivation here is to really, they want to debunk the idea that the Earth is special. Within the evolutionary narrative, it's just one planet amongst billions and billions.
Yeah.
It's not different from any other planet, really. We just got lucky with life being here. Maybe it's other places. But within the biblical worldview, the Earth is very special. God made it to be inhabited. We know God put life here directly. He put the crowning jewel of his creation on this planet. It's a very unique and very special place. This is where God became flesh and lived a perfect life and died on the cross in our place, rose from the grave, defeating death. All that took place here. So this place is special within the biblical worldview. This evolutionary narrative wants to debunk that whole thing.
Yeah, he was the God man, not the God Wookiee. right?
Or the
Yeah.
God Vulcan or
God
anything like that.
Klingon, yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And if you want to learn more about space, we got some really good stuff here. A book by Dr. Danny Faulkner called The Heavens, A Different View. And so this one gives you actually a lot of his pictures, astrophotography, I think it's called. That may be the wrong word, but wrong title.
Yeah.
Taking pictures of
Sounded
space,
good.
basically. Yeah,
Yeah, something like
I can make stuff up really good, all right? But no, it's got just a lot of beautiful pictures from
Yeah.
stars and the moon and
Lot-
space and so forth.
And also a lot of good text in there too. I mean,
Oh, a lot of good
even if
teaching.
you just look at the pictures are great. But there's also a lot of good text, Bible verses in there as well. Danny spent a lot of time working.
And
on
he's
that.
really sharp. And so
Yeah.
I encourage you to check that book out. And also the other resources online from Danny are really good
Yeah,
dealing with
yeah,
space. Check those out
absolutely.
online. All right, moving on from space. Ilhan Omar mocked for voicing outrage over Easter worship on plane. People are mocking her, "Why do you hate Christians?" So if you're not really familiar with her, she's a Democrat over in Minnesota who expressed outrage over a video of Christians singing on a plane. She saw this video of their Christians singing on a plane. She feels like that's them trying to force their religious views on those in the plane. She's outraged over it. And then she posted the video, or posted a link to it, and she put out a tweet saying, "Hey, could you imagine if I was praying on a plane? What would happen then?" Trying to basically say, well, they wouldn't allow me to do that, but I think they actually would.
They would,
Yeah,
and most people would
absolutely.
have no objection to
Right.
a person praying on a plane. It's-
They might encourage it depending on the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I think in her case, being a Muslim, she would probably need to face, toward Mecca and
Yeah.
just
Could be a bit
because of the
cumbersome.
regulations that they would have. But still, if she needed to get down into the aisle to do something like that, I don't think anybody would really object to somebody having the freedom to do that. Now, this was not a U.S. flight.
The details of this are actually very important too.
Yeah, so
Tim, you
the
looked it
flight
up.
was from Poland to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Then it was carrying a bunch of supplies and to provide help for people who are now homeless because of the war. And it was a bunch of Christian groups who banded together to bring all these goods and supplies to the people who are really hurting and suffering.
Makes sense. They were singing.
And they
Really.
asked permission from the flight attendant if they could sing some praises, and they were given permission. But she has a long history of making very strongly anti-Semitic and anti-Christian statements over and over and over again, and she very clearly pushes her Islamic beliefs and she has a very strong hatred toward Christianity and Judaism. There's no question.
It's pretty amazing how intolerant and bigoted she is towards those who don't share her
Clearly
beliefs.
not neutral, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so something to
We've
keep
got
in
people
mind.
from Minnesota here right now, and they're nodding. They know.
They know. They know.
We're sorry. Okay.
Yeah, we're very sorry.
No, she wasn't. She wasn't
she
on the
wasn't
plane
on
at
the
all.
plane. She saw
on
the
plane,
video.
but
She
just-
probably didn't know the context of the video itself.
Yeah.
Didn't
You know, the
understand
video
probably what
was
they were
just
doing.
shared by this one guy with a group of friends, but she got wind of it. Now it's got hundreds of thousands of views because she promoted it. So,
Yeah,
all
right,
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 well, a
right.
lot more people saw people praising God.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And speaking of Easter, Passover, all those sorts of good things,
Mm-hmm.
and let's go to the next article. So for Passover and Good Friday, a New York Times essayist writes about killing hateful God, which of course that seems really appropriate. Of course the New York Times would, but they decided to publish a guest essay that heavily criticized God on Good Friday at the start of Passover. So Shalom Aslander composed a piece insisting that this Passover we should stop paying attention to God, we should pass over God. We'll see what they did there. So
How
clever.
ironic, the person's name is Shalom,
Shalom,
I know,
which
right?
means peace.
Peace.
So, and where does that come from ultimately? It comes from God.
It
And
does.
this person is very angry toward God or with God, and calls, really pulls things out of context quite a bit. Talks about the plagues on Egypt and how unfair that was, because surely there were people that were being judged during that time that were innocent. Maybe these kids who were suffering because Pharaoh kept hardening his heart over and over again before God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And so how unfair that is. But what we need to understand is that God is going to judge sin. And,
Righteously so.
And he, Pharaoh had chance after opportunity after opportunity to free the people and did not. And God, if you think about this, where God's wrath was really truly carried out was on his own son, because God the Son became one of us to take that wrath. He's been in our shoes, and he has suffered more than we could ever imagine, and he's done it all without sinning. If you want to know how loving God is, you look at what Jesus had done. And so people will pull things completely out of their context. Didn't complain about what the Egyptians were doing, enslaving the Hebrews for 400 years and killing their children.
Well, the
no
author-
complaint about that.
The author even equates the plagues being poured out on Egypt. He equates that to what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians,
Right.
calling God like the Russians, and so forth.
not
And you
like
see how
it.
it's just, like you said,
They're
twisting it out of
cherry
context.
picking. Yeah, certain people have they're angry with God that the God they claim they don't believe exists. They're really mad at him,
Right.
which is really strange.
Kinda-
I get mad at unicorns all the
Are
time.
you mad at,
Yeah, I
at the
mean-
Tooth Fairy?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah, I hate the Tooth Fairy.
Bunny.
Got to go down. All
Yeah,
right.
that's right.
Yeah.
But that's what they do.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I think deep down, they know.
Well, it's
Romans
Romans 1.
1.
It's a
Yeah,
suppression
that's
of
exactly
truth.
right. It's
And
Romans.
Rob, we were talking before the show, but there's also another really good point to be fleshed out here. This guy's using a lot of moral language that he says God's being unrighteous and he's being hateful and intolerant. But you made a point earlier as we were talking.
Yeah.
What is that point?
Yeah, absolutely. As I was just reading through this article, I kept just writing, by what standard? By what standard? Because he keeps saying things like hateful, brutal, they need justice for these things. But if you are really passing over God, you're rejecting his word, what foundation, what basis do you actually have to actually call any of these things
How do you
hateful?
define right or
Well,
wrong?
Brutal,
if
right or
we're
wrong
just
morality.
from evolution, it's all about
Exactly, yeah.
struggle and death for hundreds of millions of years. So that's just the nature of the way things
Yeah.
are. So big deal, right?
Yeah. So I want you guys to understand something. Anytime you see this, they're actually what's called borrowing from the biblical worldview. They're actually borrowing from God. Or stealing from God in order to argue against God, right? So you kind of see the inconsistency there within that worldview.
It's like arguing for no oxygen while you're breathing oxygen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Arguing for air while you're using air the entire time, right? It's kind of like the child that sits in the father's lap. I think Dr. Bonson said this all the time. Greg Bonson, if you've seen any of his stuff, it's really phenomenal. But basically, he makes the analogy of a child sitting in his father's lap, slapping the father. But in order to do that, the father has to hold the child up on his lap in order to do so. So that's kind of the same thing with these atheists, the ones like Tim was saying, when they're angry with their God, God's having to hold them up in order to even do that.
And what's ironic is the fact they can argue at all literally shows that they're wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
They have to borrow from the biblical worldview the entire time, even just to try to argue.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage? You know, God sits in heaven and he laughs. I mean, they think they're going to do away with him, but ultimately we know who wins. We've read the end. Well, at least I have. I don't know if you've read the end of the book. I have. We win. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, Psalm
and it's
2.
not because of what we do. It's because of what God has already done and will do
because
in
of
the
His
future.
promise in His word.
Yep.
I read a quote the other day I thought was really good. God has won. He will win, and we will win in Him and reign forever with Him because of that. Yeah. And so the war's not over yet because we're still living in time, but ultimately God has won it, and He will win it, and we will win in Him, which is such great news. And so something to really keep in mind in this time in our lives.
Well, yeah, and let that motivate us to share the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ to a world that, even to an individual like this who desperately needs to hear it.
Yeah, we need to be praying for him, bottom line. Yep, exactly.
All right, moving on to some plants.
Especially if they come into contact with plants like the ones we're going to talk about.
Exactly.
These
plants turned predator. Not predator from the old movie Predator, but plants that turn to carnivorous animals. So carnivorous plants fascinate us as much now as they did when the gruesome diet was first discovered. So the whole thesis of this article is trying to figure out how did carnivorous plants evolve. And they kind of go into a little bit of summary of how Charles Darwin evidently made some decent observations about how there were certain plants that were carnivorous in their nature, which was pretty unique. People didn't really think that was a possibility or a big thing, but evidently it was. He did some good experiments, showed that to be a true thing, which is good observation, good science. But of course now what they're trying to do in this article is figure out, okay, how did plants go from being normal plants to these meat-eating plants or insectivores, these sorts of things? How did that transition occur? How did they evolve? And they're trying to figure that out throughout the article.
Yeah, they make several statements in here. I mean, they talk about how they had to evolve at least 12 different times.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, the dumb luck of evolution, right?
The same features evolved 12 times.
So, but they also talk about this. Evolution is sneaky and flexible. It takes advantage of pre-existing tools. Did you catch that?
Yeah.
The stuff's got to be there already. It's simpler in evolution to repurpose something than make something new, right? Because evolution cannot make something new. Evolution doesn't even repurpose anything. Natural selection acts upon things that are already there, and it results in a net loss of information, not a net gain. You're not getting new information and developing new things.
Well, and you're avoiding the question because evolution is supposed to answer where did it come from.
Right.
They're not doing that. They're saying it was already there, it was repurposed. Now the question is, where did it originally come from? Where did the programming come from to repurpose it? And that's really the ultimate question they're totally avoiding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So like when Darwin talked about the origin of species, he didn't truly talk about the origin.
That's right.
Of all those species.
He didn't.
Talking about once the matter is already here, once the life has already started, how did it diversify?
Yep.
And what he was observing is what we observe, and that is that animals change, but it's resulting in a net loss of information. We're not seeing new kinds of animals come about through gaining information. All we're seeing is net loss all the time.
Dogs stay dogs, cats stay cats.
Yeah, exactly. So what we call speciation. It's the opposite of evolution.
Fly trap, slave fly traps, right? I mean, that's basically all the way throughout the article. And whenever you're reading these kind of evolutionary articles, you have to always be looking out for those fallacies. Like Tim was saying, it's called a reification fallacy, where they try to attribute human-like qualities to a concept, right? Evolution is a concept. It's an idea. It's basically just a form of storytelling. And they say stuff like sneaky and flexible and using tools, but something that doesn't have a mind, how does that even work, right? So they're obviously already being inconsistent in that worldview right away. So at the end of the day, I mean, you have mutations, you have natural selection that will either have a loss of information or at best just a translation, basically more of a shuffling of information. That's all we see. We don't see the increase of genetic code information. That's what evolution needs, which obviously we don't see any evidence of.
It always intrigues me in these articles. They always say basically this thing evolved this brand new trait because it needed it. To give you an example here. Each time the variation that occurred, the driving force for evolution was the same, the need to find an alternative source for vital nutrients. So they needed something, so they evolved something to meet that need. But that's not how things work in the real world. If I need to fly, I don't grow wings. It might be kind of cool if I could.
Build a
but-
plane.
All right, yeah, but you cannot
Superman
do
didn't
that.
have wings, he could fly.
And then there's a limit within our genome that's placed there by the creator. So just understand as you read these, having a need does not mean you can actually just develop something from your own genome to meet that need, which
Right,
they
it's
suggest so
constantly a
often.
just so story.
really
They
is.
observe something now and they think, well, it must have evolved to get here. How did it get here?
Right.
So,
Right,
all right,
exactly.
one more.
All right, we squeeze in the
Last
last one, fun one. Inspired by prehistoric creatures, by the way, no such thing as prehistory. We got history from the beginning. But anyway,
That's
inspired by prehistoric creatures, researchers make a record-setting lens or record-setting lenses. So looking at trilobites or variation of trilobites, looking at their eyes, a very complex eye. And basically they had eyes that could focus on things close and far away at the same time, which is super cool. And so they did something called biomimicry in a sense, and they're actually copying that same sort of design so they could create cameras that can focus on things both close and far away.
Yeah, it's really cool. I thought this was really cool science. Being an engineer, I just thought this was really neat how they were able to pull this off, where this camera can simultaneously image objects as close as 3 centimeters away, so that's really close, and as far as 1.7 kilometers away. I mean, that's huge distance. And then everything in between, they have computer algorithms to then correct for the aberrations and whatnot. So basically, you have this all-encompassing, all-in-focus kind of image from as close as a few centimeters away to kilometers away, and basically just mimicking, like Bryan was saying, based on God's design of this amazing creature.
So these are creatures, trilobites, that from their story lived 500 million years ago. So they're very early, very primitive, and yet they had these incredibly complex eyes. A
Imagine
good
that.
thing-
Another dumb luck of evolution.
Yeah,
there.
it's amazing. You get something so complex that takes
Yeah.
engineers years and years and years to study and research and try to duplicate. We see this, what we call biomimicry, where people are looking at what God has created and say, that's kind of useful. That's really neat. Why don't we try to copy that in the real world? And you see that in the
It's-
designs of a lot of different things.
It's like God knows what he's doing.
Yeah, it is kind of like
Imagine
that.
that.
Imagine
It's
that.
like he's a designer.
You know
Yeah.
what? That's exactly what it is.
Well, it's a good reminder, God always knows what he's doing, right? Whether
Absolutely.
creation or with our lives, we can trust him. Guys, we're so glad you've been here with us today. This is Answers News signing off. You guys have a great day.
God bless.
See you guys.